Hey, Christian, thanks for coming on the show for us today. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, Christian Tamburr is a world-renowned vibraphonist, pianist, composer, arranger. You've done music directing for Julio Iglesias, Penn Teller, Cirque du Soleil in Macau, China, a bunch of different projects, even just related to jazz and beyond. So we're excited to talk with you today and just kind of get into some musical concepts, your latest album, and some ideas that'll help our young jazz audience.
Thanks. Wow. Well, you obviously read my bio. Yeah, it all started with jazz, but it's amazing how it's kind of panned out over the past couple of years into a lot of different unique, it's all about trying to make a living in this crazy world that we're in. So, yeah, man, it's a pleasure to be here. Happy to share a little bit of, what I've been up to.
Yeah, so I thought we'd start off really with where you began, down in South Florida and having mentors. So having the mentorship of Ira Sullivan, and I was wondering if you could get into some of what he taught you or what that experience was like.
Sure. I mean, so I was coming up into junior high school in the mid 90s, and this is where I feel like our public schools still were relatively well funded, and they would bring in guest artists to do workshops, master classes, and performances. And I was just really fortunate to be in that Central Florida area. I grew up in Cocoa Beach, Merritt Island area. And they brought in Ira Sullivan. And, as a young student, you're just like, well, who's this guy, with all these crazy
Hmm.
instruments? And literally he would show up with them all under his arms, a trumpet, a flute in this hand, then he'd have like the tenor and the flute under here, the alto flute, and you're like, what is this guy going to do? And I mean, just from the first experience of seeing him play and the masterfulness of just the facility across so many different instruments, it was hard not to just completely dive in. And, I told my parents, I was like, I want to take lessons from this guy. I want to, anytime he's playing, I want to go see him. And so I just started showing up to all of his gigs. Like my mom
Hmm.
and dad were like driving me down to South Florida. And I was lucky enough to have a couple of little jazz clubs in my area. And I remember first seeing him perform, like not in a school, but like in a jazz setting and, like in a club setting. And was just blown away. And he eventually got around to like, yeah, hey, what instrument do you play? And like at the time, all I owned was a marimba. So I'm like, I play the marimba. And he's like, cool, jazz marimba. That'll be perfect. So he's like,
Hmm.
we should play. And, of course, like mind blowing. Okay. And literally just kind of dove into anytime he would be nearby. He would come a couple hours early and we would work on tunes and and his process was always like whatever tunes he was playing. So like some of the first tunes I learned in jazz, like in the jazz vernacular, were like Mysterioso, Peace by Horace Silver. They weren't like the like entry level
Uh-huh.
tunes, right? They were all these like heavy tunes, but it was great. I didn't know any better, and he was so influential to me just diving into the music. So I just kept that up, and I think it's so important to find those mentors, these older musicians that walk the walk and talk the talk and played with the heavy cats and can share that with the youth. And I was just fortunate enough to kind of be able to tap into that.
Yeah, and Ira's still around doing that exact same thing, carrying all his instruments and mentoring young students.
Man, I hired him for a record. I guess I want to say that record was Arrivals, I think. And, I was so excited to have him. It was my first record to have him on. And I was like, we're going to track 3 or 4 tunes. And, he's like, well, I'll bring everything, And of course, we're like in the middle of the session and he shows up with all of his stuff, hasn't warmed up, has just driven 4 hours from South Florida to Orlando. And he's like, well, what's the first tune you want to play? And I was like, well, we'll do Cherokee. He's like, oh, what tune? What instrument? I was like, I don't know, trumpet. He literally takes the instrument cold out of the box, and he's just like, okay, let's take one. I was like, do you want to? He's like, oh, we'll figure it out. Literally every song, every instrument, first take. He was done in like 30 minutes. Like we did.
Yeah.
Like, who can do that? Like nobody on the planet can just like literally take the horn out of the box. I mean, he's an amazing guy. It's great to hear that he's still doing what he loves to do, which is making music.
Yeah, I mean, just this, a month or so ago, it was his birthday again, and they did a whole virtual birthday celebration, which was cool because they were playing a bunch of old albums that he was on, just
Yeah.
destroying it. Like it was like one on trumpet, then the next one was sax, equally killing. on both. And I even remember like last year, we went to his birthday hang, and it was like a 4 hour gig.
Yeah.
He was just playing. It was like 2 hour sets. Like he was like trying to get the audience's energy up, and it was like his 87th, 88th birthday.
Oh my God.
And he's like,
Yeah.
"Come on, guys, let's."
That's his thing. Depending on the gig, he can get into like a talking thing sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and like you have to be like, all right, we got to play some more. Or it's the complete opposite where you just start playing and like the gigs ended like an hour ago, but he's like, oh yeah, we need to do this. I can't tell you how many gigs I was on with him, where there was just no relevance of the fact that, like, I remember being at the showcase up in Chicago with him,
Mm-hmm.
and it was my first time playing the showcase. And, the guy who ran that, Joe Siegel, like, was very strict with, like,
Mm-hmm.
how he ran the venue. And, this is the time that you start. This is the time you end. This is the time we have to turn the venue over. And we're, like, going into hour 2 of set 1. Right. And there's like an audience of people wrapped around the building, and like Joe's like freaking out. And I was like, oh, one more. That's him, man. Filled with music. Wants
Yeah.
to share.
So after that Ira mentorship, how did you then eventually go into school at UNF? Where did that
Yeah.
lead?
Yeah, so a lot of so again, being in the Florida area, I think we all grew up there, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're just fortunate to have such an influence of music across the state, whether it was Miami or West Palm. I was up near Central Florida, and there's a lot of great musicians that back in the early 80s moved down to Central Florida to take part of the Disney thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
All these guys up the Northeast were like, forget it, we're not doing the hustle anymore. We're going to go get on a salary gig and play. And they had like 2,000 musicians, playing at the park at one point. And so
Wow.
there were some great musicians playing in that area. And I was fortunate enough to start working with a guy by the name of Michael Andrew, great vocalist out of Orlando. And he hired really great musicians. Like his bands were always the professors at either UCF, USF, or the guys would travel all the way down from Jacksonville
Mm-hmm.
at UNF. And like some of the first gigs I ever did were like Bill Prince was playing on like alto, clarinet,
Yep.
trombone, or whatever 9 instruments he could play. Barry Green was playing guitar. There was Kevin Bales would come down and play piano on some hits. It was like, and so, I was the 15 or 14-year-old kid on the bandstand, and they're all like in super recruit mode,
Mm-hmm.
and like part of that would kind of come off like, oh, okay, take it easy, guys. But they could all play, like they were all killing, and I
Yeah.
was like, if y'all are up there, like, that's where I want to be, because if that's like like if that's the infrastructure of the teaching, that's where I want to go. And I had a couple options. I was accepted to Cal Arts out in California. I was accepted to the New School up in New York, and ultimately, I just had developed this almost friendship with some of these great players, Barry, Don Zentz, who was there maybe before you guys were there, and Bill. And I felt like I not only knew them as musicians, I knew them as like, that they were going to be great teachers. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's what got me up to UNF. I graduated high school in 99 and was up there from 99 to 2001.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, what kind of experiences at UNF? I mean, those you've had those relationships, and we know even in your current kind of band situation, you still play with cats from that area. What were some of those experiences you had at UNF that kind of carried you into what you do today? Because you're doing so much. Like, we went through our experience at UNF, I guess, but I'm sure it was a different time, different sort of influences there at your time.
Right. I think with anybody, and I talk to a lot of my students about this, trying to decide where is the right place for you. And I think everybody, it's not a cookie cutter thing. It's like, if you just say, I'm going to graduate high school and I'm going to go to New York, I'm going to make it. Like, that isn't necessarily always the right channel, right? Everybody learns differently. Everybody wants to interact differently. What I loved about UNF was it was a small school, at least at the time when I was there. And again, the faculty it wasn't like 1 out of 50 in a class. It was like 1 out of 6 or 7. And so like every class was essentially a session, right?
Mm-hmm.
It made sense that like almost every class, no matter what we were talking about, like the teacher had his axe on and we were playing, right? And so I love that, like, one-on-one or a very small class size was really critical for me, because I'm not great with schoolwork, never have been. And so that kind of intensity was really valuable for me to stay engaged. Um, and the second thing was just, and I think this is again like that most like that network of musicians that you go on that journey with. It's just such a crazy time in your life, right? You're like getting out from underneath, like being at home. You're now on your own. You're like, there's this new freedoms, and you're kind of sharing that with these friends, right? And these friends also happen to be as passionate about the music that you are. And I think for me, I had a great high school with some really great musicians that were, really passionate about the music, but to be surrounded by that many students in that environment that were equally as passionate about making music and playing jazz as I was, they're lifelong friends. Billy Thornton, I've been touring with and playing with, great bass player. I mean, I met him my first day. John Davis, he was like my first rhythm section at UNF. He just tracked on my last album. So Scott Giddens, I mean, another guy who had been like a lifetime guy. When I got there, I think it was his second or third time around, but it was like these guys, I don't know, they were a part of the identity of what music I was starting to really accumulate within my vocabulary, and they continue to be. So yeah, the network and just that one-on-one was really important about UNF.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the same things that actually brought me to UNF is when I had one lesson with Barry, and then just that experience and knowing that you're going to get him as your teacher for 4 years instead of somewhere like, at University of Miami, you're going to have a TA, and maybe you'll get one of the professors later on. It's just a different kind of experience.
Yeah. Good, bad, or indifferent, right? And everybody anyone you talk to is going to be able to argue their defense of it. And I agree. I remember looking at FSU because Marcus Roberts was going to be there. And I was like, okay, that's pretty heavy. And like, I have all of the Winton records with Marcus, and like, I was just like, yeah. But then you start to do a little bit more research, and you're like, he's not there all the time. He's touring, he's traveling. I mean, all of that makes sense. I mean, I get it now, that we're out on the road making a living. Like, you can't be there all the time. But yeah, you're right. Like, at a school like UNF with that high level of guys, you're getting them every day or every lesson, and that's what's going to make you a better player.
So I'm curious what your actual lessons were like, since you were going in there, but you're vibraphonist, but there wasn't really a jazz vibes teacher, correct?
No. So I was a piano major.
Okay.
And so I was kind of connected to Kevin Bales at the time. And so I was a piano major with like a vibraphone option, I guess is what it was. But, I really didn't play much piano there. Most of my focus was on the vibes and just trying to grow the vocabulary. And so whether it was with Bill in arranging, I also had Barry for arranging, and I got a D in his class, and so that happened. But
I'll make sure to tag him in this.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I totally phoned in that or big band arrangement. I was like, the last thing I really wanted to ever do, and actually, I don't want to pigeonhole myself here, but I love big band. Right, I love like the Dream Band, Terry Gibbs big band stuff. Like, I love Basie, I love big band. So I just want to say that out, just up front. But I don't have like this itch to go arrange drop two voicings or like sax sections. It's just not like, I'm not like, oh, I'm gonna explode this into way too many people. And so like big band arranging was never something that really had my attention. I can do it. It just never was really on the radar for me of like, the small group stuff was where I was really digging. And that's what I really loved. John Ricci was there at the time, great tenor player. He was like my piano 1 instructor or something, like piano theory. And, the lessons were for me, again, like a guy like Kevin Bales. I mean, one day we'd just play tunes. Another day he'd have like his drum set set up and we'd be working on time. If you haven't checked out Kevin Bales playing drums, it's kind of epic. It's really worth trying to find video of that. But and so that's where the lessons were really valuable for, and the one-on-one. I really tried to spread out my lessons. I would get lessons with Barry, and again, just trying to get to hear one guy's approach to a tune and then go the next week and literally have somebody else approach the tune totally different and why, yeah, it was very enlightening. You know, it's not one way is the only way. There's a lot of ways to approach tune, whether it's harmony or improvisation or rhythm or whatever it is. It's a lot of different approaches. So that's, again, that's what I really tried to take away from those lessons.
That's awesome. Once you kind of came out of those experiences, though, I feel like you have definitely gone in a lot of different, explored a bunch of different areas, even outside of the jazz field. Obviously, all of that education helped kind of assist you with the foundation of that. Why did your path kind of go into these other areas, or how did you kind of go into those different venues after a jazz education, so to speak?
Yeah, somewhat out of necessity. I was living out in Las Vegas for the first time, and I was playing 5 nights a week, playing straight ahead jazz with a great band leader by the name of Noel Friedline, and we were playing busy. I mean, we were 5 nights a week at the Bellagio, like doing like, it was pretty killing. I was like 20 years old, so it was pretty epic. And all of a sudden, like 2001, September 11th comes around, and like all of the live entertainment stops. Sounds familiar, kind of like. Yeah. And so all of a sudden you're like, well, okay, now what? Like, if playing live music isn't going to be an option, like, how am I going to make a living? And I was fortunate enough to meet, you know, in a town like Vegas, you know, and I always tell students this, like, when you meet people, no matter who it is, be kind and try to make a connection, right? And make that connection be meaningful and follow up on that connection. And so whether it's handing a business card over to somebody or just getting somebody's number, like, follow up and put integrity behind that introduction, because you never know what opportunity might arise. And I had actually gotten to know Penn from Penn Teller. And they had a headline show that was just opening at the Rio. They had been moving, and they had a brand new trick. And they were like, hey, man, we'd love you to come over and check out the show and check out the music. And Penn plays upright bass. And so, you know, I was very curious. And so I went over and saw the trick. And the next thing I know, I'm in the green room, and we're talking about how we can change the music of the trick from being a piano and an upright bass to making Teller play vibraphone instead of piano. And 3 days later, I'm on the phone call with Ludwig Musser, and we've got like 6 vibraphones on order, and like we're literally changing the dynamic of the music of the show to accommodate like vibes now in the Penn and Teller show. And so part of that was being young and just being bold and saying what you thought and see what the reaction would be. But the other part of that was, like, I had built enough of a connection that I felt like they knew my situation. I proposed an idea of how we could collaborate and maybe do something together, and they were looking for something. And so it was kind of out of necessity to start venturing into these other roles of either writing or arranging. But also, you know, because I realized that there's opportunity there, right? The live music will come back, but these type of shows, something like Penn and Teller, like that will continue on. And so if I can balance the two of those, that's just 2 ways to make a living in this industry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting, both in the opportunities, the kind of variety of opportunities you do, but also musically, like, one of the things, maybe we could get into the nitty-gritty of this, is that you managed to both play all the traditional stuff. I mean, you're posting, you know, videos of playing the tune standards, but then also in a lot of your on a lot of your albums and a lot of your live shows. I mean, heck, we've even covered some of your covers because we love the reharm so much, of like, how do you take some of the modern tunes and the classic tunes, like whether it's the Beatles, or I saw you did a Phil Collins tune, or even Ed Sheeran, how do you take that music? Because you're doing both equally, you know, at a high level, but your voice is through that. So, and I think that's really interesting to young players who want to update maybe the tunes that they're playing, but want to still do it in a jazz tradition.
Right, absolutely. So I love the Great American Songbook. I love the standards, right? But looking out at my audience, I realized that bulk of material can, not all the time, but can, depending on where you are, speak to 1 or 2 generations of music, and then you start to lose engagement for a younger series of generational people. Not because they don't like the music, not because they don't think you're a good player, but because they can't really relate with the content, right? So by integrating a bit more wide spectrum of possible material to play in an audience, it's like, listen, you're not going to make everybody happy across an entire show, right? It's like you want to try to reach as many people as you can. But my goal has always been, how, if I look out to the audience and I see the age group from my age down to 20 or 15 years old, like, what are those people listening to? They're at my show, so there's some connection there. What can I play for them? And then also keeping true to balancing the set with some standards where, again, like the older generation or the older audience that's going to be there, they can really relate. And I'm not trying to appease everybody. The sets or the material that I play speaks to me. It's in there for a reason. I always tell players, or when working in creative development, I always like, what's the big why, right? Why are you playing the song? Why is the set made up of these tunes? Why does this song come before this ballad? And sometimes it just doesn't matter. Sometimes you're just doing a session, it's a casual, and you're just calling tunes, and that's great. But if you're trying to go to that next level, and you think about some of the great players that have taken their careers to point, like, I'm just going to name a South Florida giant, Pat Metheny, right? Here's a guy who, like, when you go and see his performance, it's a show. There's thought put behind each tune, why each tune is there, what tune comes before the next one. And he's really thought about that arc, not only just the song, but the whole set. And so, again, thinking about that audience out there, to me, I think it's important. Like, I want a younger generation of people to get into jazz. And if I butt up a Ed Sheeran tune, that's going to reach the audience. And then maybe there's a Beatles tune that reaches that audience. And maybe right after that, I do like some burning version of like Cherokee. Like, all of a sudden, we're like kind of cross-pollinating the audiences. Like, they're like, oh, I really wouldn't have dug that, but now I'm into this, and that's really cool. And, and hopefully they walk out of there a bit more curious. And so that's why I do it. And it's not because I'm thinking like, oh, I need to put a pop tune in here. It's like Ed Sheeran writes some great tunes. I grew up listening to the Beatles. Like when I hear a song on the radio, I'm like, oh man, that's a cool tune. I wonder how that would lay on the vibes. It comes into my songbook organically. It's never like, oh man, there are 3 standards, 1 original, 2, it's like there isn't some formula. There really isn't. But I do think the result is you have a body of work or a set or a show of music that reaches a wider demographic of audience.
How do you think of adjusting the harmony for something like the Ed Sheeran A-Team that maybe the original, has such a simple harmony, but it has a really nice melody? How do you bring that into a more jazz tradition?
Yeah, so there's a couple of rules of thought. I subscribe to, first, let me tell you what I don't like.
Okay.
I don't like music to be hard just to be hard. Never been my thing. So I generally don't, when I look at a pop tune, my first thought isn't like, how I'm going to make this so crazy different, like with crazy key signatures and harmonic interpretation, because ultimately, again, what I said before, it's important that the people listening to the music actually recognize the song, right? So to me, how I harmonically approach a reharm or an adaptation of a pop tune is to try to give the integrity of the tune and its melody a bed of harmony that is going to be still familiar enough that if somebody comes to the show and knows nothing about jazz, then they go, oh, that's that tune A-Team by Ed Sheeran. But where I can find ways to kind of integrate different harmony into a tune like that is more of I'm going to say it's more of the approach is more about finding the in-betweens, right? Really making sure that the melody stays really recognizable and the harmony doesn't distract, it supports, and its complexity helps get that new color or the new approach across, but it never gets in the way. And to me, that's how I approach it. I really don't ever try to make something so obscure that, again, the last thing I want to do is, how many people recognize that tune? You know, like I want people to check the tunes out. And again, like I did a reharm the other day of the Willy Wonka, Pure Imagination, which is one of my favorite tunes. It's on one of my records. And I had an artist that I was working with, and they were really interested in trying kind of an altering between a bar of 6 and then a bar and 3 bars of 5. And I'm like, oh man, again, going back to the big why. Why are we doing this? And is it just because we can and we can make an kind of an odd time meter thing going on? And then what made it make sense was how that person sang the melody, and all of a sudden, like that extra beat or that subtraction of putting it into 5, it made sense, and the tune had a groove to it, and it supported the melody. And so I'm always trying to keep those things in mind whenever I'm doing an arrangement, whether it's a standard or a pop tune.
Interesting. And you work a lot with different collaborations as either a director or for different artists, correct? So when you have those kind of interactions with them, is that a battle? Is it sometimes are they just leaning completely on you, or do you sometimes have to wrestle their big why, maybe for a tune that's different than maybe how you feel about it? But that kind of, I mean, that's a really interesting skill to have as a musician in a directing situation. Is that how do you kind of, what are the skills you kind of bring to those situations?
Ooh, patience. No, you know what it is yes. In all seriousness, it's about being aware of like, what is my role, right? My role is to, if I'm working for an artist and they're coming to me to bring my approach to an arrangement, it's still about them. It's about them. Like, they want my take, meaning they might want how I, they hear movement within an arrangement. I like that approach or rhythm or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, it has to satisfy their goal and how they deliver that song. So ultimately, I'm always at kind of, it's up to them how things get steered, at least initially. And then what I'll do is I'll propose a couple of different options, right? And sometimes, and in most cases, those options that's what they're looking for. That's exactly what they're looking for. But then there's times where, like, I'll get somebody's response and it's just, they're like, no, that's not working. And you kind of have to put the ego aside, because I spend a lot of time, like I do a lot of work in my pre-production studio. And so generally when they get an arrangement, before I've done any charts, it's been done in Logic, and it sounds pretty convincing. And so I'm in there, like doing the drums and like, trying to get.
I've seen that video. I've seen that video you posted on Instagram. It's crazy.
We need some we need some key drum lessons. That's what I need. I play keys, but not key drums.
Dude, yeah, key drums is like a whole thing that I get way into, and like it's actually the last thing I track, and I like it. I'm actually a better key drummer now than I am a real drummer, but. But like, you get passionate, you get involved. You're like, oh, this is the best thing since sliced bread. And then all of a sudden that person comes back and they're like, you know what? That key change, let's go up a half step. And you know what? Let's slow it down 20 clicks. And that drum groove, let's go with more of a bossa. And you're like, oh, God, like, oh. And so what I generally try to do is try to say, okay, let's talk through why you want some of these changes. Let's see which ones are really going to benefit you and what things maybe we can find a compromise. But that's what it's all about. If it's another artist, again, I'm working for them, and it's important for me to make sure that no matter what I'm doing for them, like, I'm still going to shine through that arrangement my own way. But like, yeah, you have to put the ego aside and be willing to compromise. That's just part of that thing. You're working for somebody else.
Yeah.
When you're starting these pre-production things, are you starting with piano? Or are you starting more with the vibes approach?
Yeah, mostly piano. It's just, I can hear the harmony and the melody thing together. On some of the stuff that I do on like Instagram, it might start with piano first and then I add the vibes, and it might be the other way around. But when I'm doing like heavy arranging or the large production stuff, if I have the bed or the integrity of the rhythm and the harmony on one instrument as like a starting point, like piano from beginning to end, I can add things in and layer things in and then pull that piano part out and then reintegrate a new piano part that isn't as full. Because the way I try to do it is like, here is everything I need. Here's the groove. Here's all the harmony. Here's the melody. And, you know, piano is just great for that, right? You can do all that stuff. But ultimately, once you get the bass and the drums and any horns or any strings or any other elements in there, usually that piano part is way too heavy. So usually my tracking method will be piano first, layer, and then pull that piano part out and retrack the piano part as a player versus like as a structure thing. So,
yeah, interesting. Is there, between all the instruments that you're playing, I mean, that you play, even between vibes, even strictly between vibes and piano, is there a mental shift at any point? I mean, I'm even just thinking voicing wise, like, or is it so natural? You just like, do you make any mental adjustments with how you're playing vibes versus, or does it just serve each other in that sense?
Yeah. I can't play everything on piano that I can play on vibes. So that's a real reality. That mostly is a facility thing. I've got pretty strong facility on the vibes as far as like speed and just accuracy. I've been doing it way too long. The piano is still a hard instrument for me. And so if it's something really complex, yeah, it's like I have to really think through it and figure out how the heck am I going to play this? And it really depends. But yeah, I've been doing the switch back and forth so much that most of the times when I'm writing, especially melodic lines, if I'm writing an original tune or something like that, I'm always thinking about this very strong melodic lead that in most cases I won't play something on one that I can't on the other. The only caveat to that is a couple of tunes that I'm just like, yeah, I'm not going to try to play that on piano. I'm going to play that on vibes, and I will hire a piano player to play that.
Yeah. Actually, one of the questions it kind of brought up, we got asked this from Tom Brown .studio. He was asking how you developed your bebop chops. So I'm assuming he means on vibes, you know, on something like hearing you on Cherokee, where it's just ripping through. Any advice for him on that?
Yeah, you know, yeah. First of all, I tell everybody, like, there isn't magic to this. It doesn't just like appear one day in your arsenal of chops. It comes from listening and transcription, you know, and listening and the transcription thing for me is really critical because I would never want to hear a play like. You don't want to hear that transcription in an improvised solo. You want to hear the method behind the transcription in the solo, right? So when you transcribe somebody and you really take a great bebop player, whether it's Clark Terry or Oscar Peterson or Sonny Stitt or Cannonball or any of those guys, right? And you're like, okay, I'm going to transcribe this line. To me, what I'm looking at is like, well, why are they playing? What is that doing that's leading them from one harmonic movement, one chord to another? And the line, sure, you're going to transcribe that and figure out what they're playing, but more importantly, you're going to figure out how they're getting from one place to the other. And that's what bebop really is. It's getting from one place to the other. Like when we think about improvisation, you know, we have kind of that strong melodic lead line, and then we have all this kind of I'll call it fluff, but you know, it's all this chromatic movement or you know, lines that are you know, anything that's kind of outlining the chordal structure that supports that lead line. And so whenever I have anybody work on bebop, I make them play the melody of the tune. And by playing the melody of the tune, so they have to execute the melody of the tune. And if there's space, and again, this isn't how we would play it, right? This is a practice method. If there's space, you fill the space from one melody note to the other. So it allows you to be confined within the fact that you have to play the melody, but it gives you some options to either add leading notes or chromatic lines or whatever it might be from note to note in that melody, so that you can kind of hear what makes up that bebop terminology, which is, to me, what getting you from one note to the other, or one line to the other, one harmonic idea to the next. So to me, the best way to work on bebop is to take one of your favorite tunes, transcribe a great solo over it, really assess what's harmonically happening, and how it's getting from one point to the next, chord by chord. And the second thing is to take that melody of that tune and try to use the melody as a springboard to add in other notes around that melody, which work because they're the melody, right?
Mm-hmm. When you're saying that for transcription, are you also including writing it, actually writing it down and notating it, or is that less important for you?
I think everybody's different. I can't stand writing out transcriptions. It's like I used to do it a lot. Now it's interesting. The transcription work that I do now is more for artists,
mm-hmm.
and it's more like, it's a different type of transcription. Like, what is going on here? Like, what? Like trying to listen to a pop tune and try to figure out what somebody's singing. It's a different type of transcription. In the value of writing it out is that you literally have to do it over and over and over and over and over again. And I actually think the writing it out is the least result, is the smallest result of it. It's like, you're like, oh, here it is. The result is that you've probably had to listen to that one section 200 times to get it written out. To me, that's what's ingraining into your brain.
Mm-hmm.
Are you memorizing the notes? Probably not. After 200 times, if you don't know it, you're probably not going to know it. So no, I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think if somebody can just transcribe it and learn it and play it back, that's we're just practicing what's, we're shedding our ear, so whatever your process.
Yeah.
So Christian, doing research for this podcast, I saw this great video of you playing some music from your most recent project, all on solo piano. And I just want to learn more about how that project came to be, and the uniqueness of that project. It's something that I haven't ever heard of before, and I think that's something new to you as well. How did that project start?
Yeah, sure. So about 5 years ago, I was working on a project in New York, just off Broadway, with a great producer by the name of Cecilia Johnson. Her husband is Seward Johnson, and Seward Johnson is a world-renowned bronze sculpture artist. And I wasn't real familiar with his work, but I had seen some of his sculptures before, and of course, getting to know him and meet him was very inspiring. And again, like what we were talking about before, you never know, follow up, stay in touch. And we actually got to know each other a bit, and I was doing a show for him and his wife in New Jersey at the Grounds for Sculpture, which is a 26-acre sculpture park just outside of Hamilton, New Jersey. And I was walking through the gardens, and I'm always solid for a good pun. And the name of the gardens are called Grounds for Sculpture. And I was walking through all the sculpture, and I was like, well, what about Sounds for Sculpture? And I was looking at all these incredible sculptures, and he works in the realm of realism. And, it was like a frozen scene in a play. It was a husband talking with his wife. There was these 4 women dancing in front of this huge pond. I mean, it was just I felt like if I hit play and those sculptures came alive, I could hear the soundtrack behind that scene. That makes sense. And so, that was where the idea came from. I was like, well, what about Sounds for Sculpture? So I spoke with Seward and his atelier and all of the legal team and said, I would like to select 10 of your sculptures to write 10 original songs by the same name. And they were super enthusiastic. They were more than giving with regards to the licensing, and let me essentially pick whatever sculptures I want. I selected 10. And that's the new record. It's all original compositions inspired by 10 of Seward Johnson's original bronze sculpture works. And his sculptures have been, at Times Square. They still are on exhibit at the National Harbor in D.C., at the Chicago Pier. It's amazing. When we do the show, we premiered it at Lincoln Center in New York in August, before the record came out. And I was astonished. About 50% of the audience were hardcore jazzers. 50% of the audience was sculpture and art lovers. And talk about this great way of art inspiring art. And so, it was a great, really unique project to kind of create. It was a bit just like an idea that popped into my head, and now it's like one of my favorite projects. So it's been quite a journey.
Was there any way you approached it differently? I have to ask because it's like as approaching music, writing music from that as the inspiration. How did you, was the emotional response your emotional response to it, or did you imagine different? You know what I'm saying? Because like maybe someone experienced it differently, or how did you write to that?
So one of the things Seward was really adamant about is that he didn't want to impose a perceived notion of how his art should be experienced, right? He didn't want to force you to experience his art the way he wanted it to be very individual, right? And so I said, listen, I'm walking up to these sculptures, and my takeaway, my personal takeaway, is the inspiration for this song. That's not to say that anybody can come up and see these sculptures anytime, anywhere, and have their own takeaway. This is my artistic vision of what these sculptures mean. And so it was very much about, this is what it means to me. I did very limited, on purpose, research about the backstory of each sculpture. It was more about, if you walked up to it in the park, what do you think? And to me, I approached the writing almost like I was writing for a theater piece, or because they really became these characters and these scenes. And each song kind of progresses like a theater piece, starting with The Awakening, which is the title track and the title, and it starts the record, and ends with the Embrace. Every song, just like we were talking about before, has a reason that it comes next and follows, and that story kind of goes on a journey. And so my approach was less about like, what kind of jazz snobbery am I going to try to insert into these tunes? Because if you listen to the record, the tune, I mean, it is a jazz record, but the influence is like singer-songwriter. It's got Americana. It's got a sense of like bluegrass. I mean, there's a lot of different influences, not because I necessarily went out of my way. It was just, that's what I heard. That's like, and I said, my approach, the vibes and my approach to writing is going to be the kind of the steady that goes through this entire project, and how those songs take shape. I try not to limit myself like, oh, this needs to live in 1950s bebop, or this is going to be modern jazz. It's like an Ira saying, it's just music, man. It's like, don't put a label, and so that was it. It was like the first record that I ever did like that. And it's been a lot of fun.
One thing I thought was really interesting with it was I was first listening to it without knowing that it was related to the sculptures. I was just checking out your latest one. And so when listening to it, you don't get the feeling like it needs to see the sculpture. Like each of the tunes stand on themselves, like on their own with the melody and with the feel of them. But then it definitely adds a lot to it when I was checking out the song, listening to it while looking at the sculpture, because you can start to hear some of those elements, or at least my interpretation of what elements maybe you were drawing from. So like with Awakening, the sculpture, he's like in the earth and like reaching out. And you can hear that with the low piano, like the bass part, and then also the melody on top, which seems to like reach out. So there's like these aspects, at least as a musician, that I'm trying to pick up on, or like Jazz Dream, where one of the descriptions on the soundsforsculpture.com talking about like, yeah, if it was these guys, all these jazz cats playing together, they'd be just hanging on a blues. They don't need anything more than that per se to just like converse. So it added a lot to the song, and it was kind of a unique way of listening to it, because you're trying to like figure out some of these elements.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, like, so when we do the show live, we bring the ability to project all the images on LED wall or on projection screen. If we don't have that, like when we did it at Dizzy's, we did actual canvas artwork of each sculpture. And, it's this unique perspective, like you said. Like, I like to think that the music stands on its own, and I appreciate that you saying that, because, that was nerve-wracking, like in the green room at Dizzy's, and we had 6 shows, 3 nights, and I was like, man, Like, is this worthy of this space? Is this worthy of this town? You know, because you can start to get into your head a little bit about the fact that you don't have like Stella by Starlight to jump off to, and everybody looks like they're like checked out.
In your jazz dizzy set list, yeah.
Like, yeah, it's like the jazz, you know, life raft. You know, you're like, throw me a standard. You know, don't have that as an option. I was like, man, I hope my 90 minutes of my music that I grew in my head is worthy of everybody's time, right? And so it was really crazy because it was the first time in a long time that I was legitimately nervous about premiering work. But what I realized is by giving people this visual perspective of seeing the sculpture with the music, they have a unique perspective as to what that origin of the inspiration for that original song is. And a lot of times, you know, when you say, you know, you see somebody playing, they're like, oh, next tune we're going to do is an original of mine. It's about love. You know,
Yeah.
Cool. Like, just get to the blowing section, dude. You know, like, whatever. Yeah. Just like get there, man. And so now I hope that the audience has at least this point of the origin of what the inspiration was, and whether the music matches for them or it lines up, or it just gives them something else to kind of experience in this like multi-dimensional artistic performance. Like, to me, it's a win-win. So, but that means a lot, Chase. Thanks. I'm glad you dug.
Yeah, well, I think it's so smart because, like you were saying, you had like 50% jazz lovers and then sculpture lovers. Like, it's a great way of connecting that music of jazz or the improvisation to an audience that might otherwise have, you know, as a non-musician, wouldn't necessarily know how to like approach it. If they don't know what they're hearing, they're like, yeah, I think I liked it. It was kind of fast. It was kind of like, they don't know how to describe any of it, but it gave them something to like approach.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, listen, I don't know about you guys when you're out playing, but like, you know, if you're out there, I mean, I get this comment a lot. I always try to take it as a compliment, but when somebody comes up and they say, I never thought I liked jazz until I saw you, and you're like, thanks. You know?
No, that's a diss on everyone else they saw before you about how they couldn't connect them to the music. So you're the first person. So that's a compliment. It's still a compliment to you.
They're like, no, jazz, that's cute, you know, but no, you know, you realize that this is my point. Just like, we're trying to share great music. We're trying to have this artistic voice of originality and bring, you know, move this music forward into 2020 and beyond. Like, yeah, I think the perception of what is jazz, I don't know. Like, nowadays we don't have record stores, so we don't need the different bins to put everything in. Mm-hmm. Everybody has a Spotify playlist that they listen to, you know, music through. So it's like, to me nowadays, if you can bring content, music that is enjoyable to not only listen but also experience live, like whether you label it with jazz or you label it with folk or whatever it is, if it's good music, like people are going to enjoy themselves. And you're right, like this way of kind of introducing multiple audiences to an experience. Yeah, I hope that some of them walk away, like the jazz lovers walk away checking out some sculpture that they never saw before. Mm-hmm. And the sculpture lovers might like jazz. You never know. So yeah, it's kind of a cool experience after the show to talk to people.
Yeah, it seems like a very similar approach to what we try and do with JazzMemes in a way, in bringing a younger audience to the music through the memes or these cultural elements that they're used to seeing.
Right. Yeah.
So I just react to that on.
For sure, man. Yeah, it's like yeah, we got to continue to grow our audience. That's it, right? And that's what you guys are doing. So it's great.
Hey, man. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Christian. We covered so much, and I really hope this introduces your music to all of our audience, and people get into not only The Awakening, but all the things you've done. I mean, they're like I said earlier, like we still have those records and check them out. They're classics to us, and part of our jazz education when we were growing up. So we appreciate you coming on and taking the time.
Oh, Kevin, Chase, thank you so much. It's great to see you guys, and congratulations on all that you're doing musically and with the JazzMemes. And thanks for having me. This has been a blast.
Yeah. Thanks, Christian.